All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on cross-border CCS in Asia Pacific. My name is Han Le, and I will be your MC for today. But before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping notes. So this webinar will go for about an hour, and we will have a Q&A session in the second half of the webinar. And please use the Q&A function in your webinar app to submit your questions. And just a quick note that this webinar is being recorded. So I'm delighted to welcome you into this important discussion organized by ANGEA, the Asia Natural Gas and Energy Association. ANGEA plays a crucial role in promoting low-carbon energy solutions in Asia Pacific, with a particular focus on facilitating the transition to low-carbon energy sources. So today's topic of cross-border CCS is particularly timely for our region. As Asia Pacific continues to grow and develop, the need for collaborative approaches between countries to carbon capture and storage, or CCS, become increasingly critical. So cross-border CCS presents unique opportunities for nations in this region to work together in reducing carbon emissions while maintaining economic growth. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Pong Everingham, the CEO of ANGEA, who will share more about ANGEA's vision and the importance of cross-border CCS in our region. Pong, the floor is yours, and I will share the screen.
Thanks very much, Han. And again, welcome to everybody. Thank you for making the time to attend and listen to this important topic. As Han said, my name is Paul Everingham. I'm the Chief Executive of the Asia Natural Gas and Energy Association, otherwise known as ANGEA. We are a regional trade and policy organisation that works with governments and industry in the region to ensure that Asia has access to affordable, reliable and lower carbon sources of energy. This obviously includes LNG, but it also includes best practice abatement policy like carbon capture and storage. Our member companies come from across the entire LNG supply chain, and for that matter, they also come from across the CCS value chain. We have energy producers, energy users, transport companies, infrastructure companies, manufacturers, engineering companies, technology companies, and more. Collectively, our member companies have a very significant delivery and operational experience in carbon capture and storage. Chevron and Exxon jointly operate the largest CCS project existing in the world today. BP is currently has under development a CCS project in Indonesia. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and JGC have worked on some of the most significant CCS projects in the world. Santos has just opened an onshore CCS project in Australia. Woodside is currently developing one. Exxon's developing an onshore CCS project in the southern states of the United States. So you can see from that we have a vast experience in both delivering and operating in carbon capture and storage across a range of jurisdictions. ANGEA has three key policy priorities. The first being ensuring that there's LNG supply certainty into the Asia Pacific. Without that certainty, LNG will not be able to play the significant role that we see it playing to help with energy demand in Asia alongside decarbonisation of energy supply chains. The second priority is market development. Many emerging Asian nations are coming off a low base when it comes to LNG import infrastructure. And finally, but importantly, we also have a policy stream on best practice abatement and decarbonisation in Asia. The IPCC and the International Energy Agency both identify CCS as a technology that must be significantly scaled up in the pursuit of any net zero goals. Notably, the Asia Pacific, you can see from this slide, that could be storing between 2 and 3 gigatons per annum of CO2 by 2050. This is more than 8 times current volumes, so we have a lot of work in front of us. Energy demand out to 2050 in Asia is forecast to be very strong, and much of this growth will come from hard-to-abate industries, power, steel, cement, chemicals, and the like. CCS must play a key role in reducing emissions from these hard-to-abate sectors. We believe that with the right policy and regulatory settings, Asia can become the world leader in cross-border CCS. You may ask, why do we think this? Well, firstly, CCS is not new to us. The fundamentals in injection and storage have been proven for decades in our industries. And while CCS is currently not inexpensive, without it, the cost of decarbonisation for Asia will be prohibitive. Unlike Europe and the United States, the major emitting countries are distant from the largest storing geographies in the Asia region. Major Asian economies like Japan, Korea, Singapore, and others have the capacity to capture emissions, but do not have the storage. Other Asian countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, and Timor-Leste possess the storage capacity and have signalled that they could be potential recipients of transported emissions. While there are some precedents in the Northern Hemisphere for cross-border CCS, there is little Asian experience to draw on. Also, many countries in Asia have differing legal and regulatory frameworks. With this in mind, ANGEA initiated the Cross-Border Carbon Accreditation Framework Study in 2023. We commissioned Boston Consulting Group to assist with examining and reviewing key elements and topics to support governments and industry in the region to advance the bilateral agreements that are necessary for such projects to be implemented. Our study provides a useful framework for all stakeholders to accelerate the development of cross-border CCS in Asia, with recommendations on bilateral government agreements and also commercial agreements. The goal of our study is to facilitate a common understanding of key issues and complexities in the region. The ANGEA BCG study focuses on the complexities of transboundary CO2 transactions that will be required because of our regional geological disparities. In developing our study, we consulted widely with key governments in Asia that are pursuing cross-border CCS, as well as consulting with industry, with multilateral financing institutions, and with non-government organisations. This work sought to understand the international norms and protocols that apply to cross-border CCS, as well as key learnings from both the European Union and the United States. Before I close, it would be remiss of me not to make special mention of some of the key people involved in the development of this study. Our next speaker is Ms. Casey Dalhotel. Casey approached me in 2023 with the concept for this framework study. Without Casey, this study would not exist. The members of the ANGEA working group all played a significant role. Our CCS policy specialist, Ms. Han Lee, was instrumental in the development of the work. And finally, the BCG team, who did a fantastic job putting the report together. To Ashish, to Rashid, and to Minai, thank you. I hope you all enjoy the session on cross-border CCS in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul, for your kind words and for the insightful overview. As Paul mentioned, our next speaker is the driving force behind this study, the cross-border CCS study, and will bring valuable insights from her vast experience as an energy industry professional. So please welcome Casey Delatal, Senior Director of ExxonMobil. Casey will present the key recommendations for cross-border CCS study on bilateral agreements. Casey, please go ahead.
Thank you and good morning. And thank you, Paul. That was very nice. So again, I'm Casey Delotel. I'm the chairman of the CCS working group within ANGEA, which is the committee responsible for pulling together the report. As we began the study, we actually, as a working group, started with some principles we wanted to adhere to. The first principle, and this is one of the key ones, is to rely on current international guidelines. We understand these guidelines are subject to updating and change based on realities on the ground. CCS is a new issue, and so some of the standards will have to catch up. But the key idea is not to go against the underlying principles of these guidelines or reinvent the wheel. The second was to avoid double counting of emission reductions in the accounting process. We believe that this would be critical in terms of the integrity of the projects and communicating with the general public what the actual reductions from these projects could be. Third, we wanted to define procedures to account for emission reversals in the case of leakage. We thought that this would be extremely important to ensure credibility of these agreements and the ability of the governments to regulate these projects. Fourth, we felt we should encourage best practices, international best practices when we're operating these projects, whether it's the transportation, capture, injection, or monitoring of the CO2. And finally, we wanted the recommendations to be technology neutral. This is an evolving industry. Technologies are developing. We didn't want the agreements to be so prescriptive that they actually de-incentivize innovation in this space. So from the report, we identified some key areas that we would like to see clarified in the bilateral agreements. Now, the basic methodology that we used is we looked at what was already agreed to in the multilateral space. We looked at what the regulations were in both the capture and the storage countries. We looked at some of the standards in IPCC and ISO and others, and we tried to figure out where the gaps were and what needed to be clarified specifically for industries to feel comfortable in spending the investment dollars. So from this, we came up with 5 recommendations. The first recommendation is clarify who owns the emission rights. So what country counts these emission rights against their indices and inventories? Second, who has jurisdictional accountability for the emission leakages and who determines what the mechanism is for the reversals of these emissions? Third, a guarantee that we can share data across borders. In oil and gas sector, for example, data sharing can be very sensitive. We want to guarantee that we can share data for the purpose of monitoring and verification and ultimately certifying the reductions. Who has regulatory responsibility during CO2 transportation, particularly when it's going through international waters or a third-party country? And finally, define the dispute mechanism between the two countries. Having the commercial project managers understand how disputes between countries would be managed is crucial in basically determining FID. So within these topics, we actually came up with different options. So particularly in the 3 sort of most critical areas. Let me go through and just walk quickly through which each of the options we laid out. First, on defining who owns the emission rights, there's 3 different options that we identified. One, that the capture country actually has 100% of the reductions. And the idea behind this is as they capture it, they can reduce the emissions from their NDCs. The second is that the capture country owns the rights, but agrees to generate ITMOs and share those with the storage country. We understand that this can be bureaucratically difficult, but it is an option in the international space. And the third is that the capture and storage country in the bilateral agreement determine how to split the emissions. There's some sort of percentage split between the two countries, and as the CO2 is injected, they can then report their percentage. In terms of defining the jurisdictional accountability for the emission leakage, there's also 3 options. These options are based on where the handover between the capture country and the storage country happens. The first option is that the handover of the carbon accounting responsibility is actually at the border between the storage and the capture country. If they're not adjacent, this would happen at the border of the storage country. Option 2 is that the handover of responsibility is actually at the receiving terminal or the first touch point on land in the storage country. The third option is that the handover is actually at the injection point. So that would mean the capture country would be responsible all the way up to the injection site. Third, defining who has regulatory responsibility during transportation, we came up with 2 options. The first is it's determined by international standards, which would basically align with the London Protocol. So even if a country was not a signatory to the London Protocol, they would agree in the bilateral space to conform to that standard. The second option is a mutually agreed to handover point somewhere between the 2 countries. So there's a lot of options that countries can pursue under these agreements. There's a lot of pros and cons to each of these options. So let me hand it over now to BCG to talk more in depth about the pros and cons.
Thank you. Thank you, Casey, for sharing these important recommendations. So we now move to a detailed examination of implementing cross-border CCS projects and some of these options that Casey has mentioned into more details. So the next part of the presentation will be delivered by our experts from BCG. I would like to introduce Carl Clayton, partner of BCG, Rajit Agarwal, principal, and Kok Ming Ai, from consultant from BCG. BCG team, please take it away.
Thank you, Han, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in. Let me introduce the study in a bit more detail, and then over the next 10 to 12 minutes, we will, detail out a couple of recommendations that Casey had already summarized and go into the details of the pros and cons, etc. And then, we can switch to Q&As. So the study that we did on cross-border with ANGEA, on cross-border CCS acceleration with ANGEA, focuses on 4 main chapters, split across 4 main chapters, starting with the introduction and the case for cross-border CCS, and then ending with the application or the recommendations of how this study could be useful for various countries in Asia Pacific. I think the majority of the analysis and insights are covered in the middle 2 chapters. The first of these is on accounting for emission reductions. So topics like who owns the rights to emission reductions, how do leakages affect these emission reduction units, and what should be the MRV process that should be followed in a cross-border context. So things like those. And then the second, I think, important chapter is focusing on operationalization aspects related to transportation and storage. So topics like which transportation modes should be used and should be allowed between different geographies, what should be the MMV process, and quite importantly, what happens in case of leakages, right? Who owns the liabilities for these leakages in an international setting? So today, I think what we will do in the next 10 minutes or so, deep dive into 2 of these recommendations, which are highlighted on the slide. So number 1 on the rights to emission reductions, and number 2, the interplay between permanence and liabilities and the operating liabilities. And then I think we can take questions and open up the floor for all participants. So I think I'll invite my colleague Minai to go through the analysis on 2 of these points that, like I mentioned, and then we can take it from there. Minai?
Yeah, thanks, Rachit. Hi, everyone. I'm Minai here. So I'll go through the 2 topics as Rachit talked about. First, I'll go through what we talk about emission reduction rights, which I think Casey kind of briefly talked about as well, but I'll go through each of the pros and cons and the different options here, and then we'll go through as well in terms of what happens when there is a leakage and how do you adjust for the emission reductions from a cross-border CCS project. So broadly speaking, in terms of emission reduction claims, cross-border CCS can be used for own claims by a project proponent that is sponsoring or carrying out the cross-border CCS project, which can then count towards their own host country NDCs and greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Or it could be used to generate credits for training. But from what we see, given the price of CCS today, and especially for cross-border CCS, the likely primary use case in the near term is probably more for claims towards a domestic ETS system or to reduce a carbon tax liability of a project proponent that is then count towards national level inventories, rather than for trading or credit generation to like a voluntary carbon market, given that the prices of credits are not at that stage right now. So we'll focus a bit more on how that works in terms of claims. And if we go to the next slide, I'll lay out the three options that are possible when we looked at how CCS projects work today and when that is translated into a cross-border scenario in a context like Asia Pacific, where there are many different carbon markets and carbon market systems. How do we ensure that there is no double claiming of emission reductions from a cross-border CCS project? That's really what this aims to address. So we have three options here that we laid out. The first option is where there's a single ownership, very straightforward. Second option is where it's a single ownership with potential of trading or selling the credits. I'll talk a bit more about this later. And then the third option is for where there's joint ownership of the emission reductions. So each of these options, of course, they come with their own pros and cons, but I think when we look at the practicality of it applying to today's context, it's very likely that the first option would be the most straightforward. So this is an option where the capture country retains the rights to the emission reductions to claim towards their NDCs, and there's no emission reduction benefit for storage countries. This is a very clear-cut way of assigning the emission reductions to ensure that there's no double counting of the reductions from both the capture and storage country. And it's based on the principle that the ownership of the emission reduction rights should go to where the emissions would have taken place. So the emitting country where the emissions were produced in by the emitter, that would be where these emission reductions should go to. And it provides a very clear case for the capture country to incentivize cross-border CCS projects, as that's likely where the sponsorship of the project would come from as well. The downside to that, of course, is that storage countries will not have any emission reduction benefit, but there could be other benefits like what Paul mentioned earlier, where they have revenues to be earned, and that also brings in some investments into storage countries where they can build their own domestic capabilities for CCS. So that's for option one. Option two is a little more complex or a little more forward-looking in the future, as mentioned earlier, where this is single ownership still, but there's an opportunity for trading or selling of the emission reductions that come out of the cross-border CCS project. So in this scenario, the capture country is able to retain the rights to the emission reductions to generate Article 6.2 ITMOs, essentially carbon credits generated under Article 6.2, which allows government-to-government trading. And they may share a proportion of the ITMOs generated with the storage country that they're storing the CO2 in. So as you see in this middle graph here, the capture country owns the mitigation outcomes. They can then internationally transfer it to other countries to sell that as credits and share part of that with the storage country. So the intention of this is really to allow storage countries to be able to also benefit beyond the storage fees that they are receiving. And it still ensures that there's clear credit ownership rights using an already established mechanism. So that's still a very clear way to ensure that there's no double counting. However, this is really dependent on the capture country or project proponents' intended use of the cross-border CCS project, and they may not agree to generate ITMOs where there might be a lot more obvious economic benefits of using the CCS emission reductions towards their own greenhouse gas inventory accounting and to count those towards their NDCs. Because this would also mean that the capture country would not be able to claim for the emission reductions themselves. So this is option two, really laying out like a future potential pathway where if cross-border CCS becomes a lot more common, then there could be this opportunity of generating Article 6.2 credits and sharing that with the storage country. And finally, we come to the third option, which is a joint ownership. This one is a little bit more, I think, considering a possibility of where the capture country and the storage country has joint ownership of being able to claim for the emission reductions, and they agree on a split to claim towards their NDCs. That will need to be worked out in a bilateral agreement, but what we see is that it can still be claimed to a project proponent or like a private sector emitter that is based in the capture country. That's count towards the capture country's NDCs, and part of that claim from the carbon that is stored in the storage country counts towards the storage country's emissions inventory as well, and that can count towards their NDCs. So this also allows the storage country to have that opportunity to benefit beyond their storage fees. But the downside to that is it's not clear if this would be accepted by IPCC or UNFCCC in practice, given that there's no carbon project that exists right now that follows this sort of both parties claiming scenario. And I think Article 6 was precisely created so that there's very clear mechanism for countries to share mitigation outcomes. So the risk of double counting in this scenario will need to be very carefully managed. So essentially, these are the three options for emission reduction rights. I'm happy to take on any questions on this later on as well. But next, I'll go into how the risk of CO2 leakages can be addressed via the concept of permanence and also operational liabilities. So when the CO2 passes through the entire CCS value chain, there is of course that risk of the CO2 being leaked at any part of that value chain where different parties are holding control or responsibility of the CO2. And so the question that we are seeking to answer is, if the emissions are leaked at each part of that value chain, how does that leaked emission get accounted for? Who adds that to their greenhouse gas inventory? Who adjusts the emissions that have already been claimed for, and ensure that there's no concept of being claiming for emission reductions that have since been leaked? So that's more or less the concept of permanence when we look at the carbon markets and existing projects right now, where there's also this concept of needing to ensure that there's long-term permanence of the emission reductions and that you're not claiming for credits that emissions that have been leaked back into the atmosphere. So that's the first part. The second part is that when that leakage happens, there needs to be this clear concept of how do you ensure that a party would be responsible for site remediation and any measures that are required to rectify that leakage. So these are the two concepts that we are addressing right here. So I'll tackle the first point first in terms of permanence and how do you ensure that the emissions that are being leaked are being adjusted for, so that you're not claiming for essentially reductions that do not exist. So three options here for countries to decide when they hand over the liability of needing to account for those emissions that are leaked. So the first option is a handover at the border. And when we talk about handover, this is essentially the point where the capture country hands over that responsibility of any leaked emissions to the storage country, and any leaked emissions need to be counted towards the storage country's greenhouse gas inventory. So option one is at the border. I'll talk more about this later. Option two is handover at the receiving terminal of the storage country. And option three is handover at the injection site at the storage country. So each of these have its pros and cons as well. Option one is where at the transports during shipping or pipeline, as soon as the CO2 passes the borders from the capture country to the storage country, then that any leaked emission after that point would be added to the storage country's greenhouse gas inventories. This is of course the preference of capture countries. And existing IPCC guidelines, if we look at the, I think, 2006 IPCC guidelines, it may be interpreted that it's following this approach where they say that countries need to report on emissions within their own borders. So if we looked at it at a very literal sense, it would seem to suggest that once the CO2 leaves the borders of the capture country, it is no longer their responsibility to account for those emissions. However, this doesn't align with accounting standards where emission reductions are typically certified based on the amount injected for a CCS project. If we look at all of the different accounting methodologies across different standards, even for the voluntary carbon market, the emission reductions are typically only certified at the point of injection once you've confirmed that you have successfully sequestered the CO2. Secondly, this also creates complexities in terms of accounting for transport operators, as they will need to very clearly delineate the point of border crossing, and this may lead to extra costs from metering requirements as well. And the third complexity to this is that countries will need to agree on that accounting split for international waters and third-party countries, as it may not always be that journey from capture to storage country without any in-between where they might also pass over waters like this. So these are some of the complexities for option 1. Option 2 is where handover is at the receiving terminal of the storage country. So this helps to reduce the metering burden of the operators, as they will only need to measure the amount that is collected and transferred to the next operator. It reduces the accounting complexities, as CO2 streams can be mixed once received at the terminal, given that what happens would be the capture country would claim for emission reductions of the CO2 that is passed at the receiving terminal, and any leaked emissions after the receiving terminal would need to be accounted for by the storage country in their greenhouse gas inventory. And it is also kind of an in-between option where it reduces the liability on storage countries compared to that first option, where they only take on the liability from the receiving terminal onwards. However, it still doesn't really quite align with accounting standards based on certification by amount injected, and it also may not align with IPCC guidelines if we look at that the concept of countries reporting on emissions within their own borders. And it also means that capture country would have to take on accountability for leakages beyond their boundaries, as they take on all the way until the CO2 reaches the receiving terminal. And finally, we come to the third option. I'll try to speed up a little bit here as we're short on time. This is where the handover is only at the injection site. So therefore, right to the point before the CO2 is being injected, any leaked emissions will have to be reduced from the claims of the capture country towards their NDCs, and also the emitter who's trying to claim that towards like a carbon tax scheme, for example. This is, of course, the preference of storage countries, as it reduces their liability. It aligns with the accounting standards, as mentioned, and it also reduces the metering burden of operators, as it's very clear-cut when you transfer it at the injection point. However, this may not be aligned with IPCC guidelines as well, and capture countries will need to take on accountability for way beyond their boundaries, all the way up to at the storage country until the CO2 is injected. And the CO2 streams may not be clearly separated after the receiving terminal and before injection, so there may be some accounting complexities here as well. So of course, with each option, there are its own merits and its own disadvantages, and ultimately, I think as what Casey mentioned, it would be up to the two countries to decide bilaterally on what works for them, as we see that there's no one way that will work for all of the countries in this region. I think we are short on time, so I maybe will not go through this slide too much in detail. This is more on operational liabilities and how do you ensure that each party has some responsibility for remediation. So essentially, we looked at a 3-tier system based on projects that are in the US and Europe. And we see that what works best is this 3-tiered system, where the first tier is that the liability is on the private sector that holds the responsibility for any remediation. So storage operator will cover liability during operations, during storage, and during site closure and post-closure period. Once they fulfill all post-closure period requirements, then there's a transfer of responsibility to the regulators. But in this time, as the regulators hold on that long-term stewardship of needing to monitor the site, they would typically want to tap onto an escrow fund or a similar mechanism, a fund that's put aside that can be used to cover the cost of that's contributed through a percentage of storage fees. So we've seen a couple of countries do that, where they charge a storage fees from each of the storage operators during that operational period, and use that then to manage the remedial action that is related to CO2 leakages during that time. And it's only finally if any damages exceed the escrow fund, then the regulators will provide indemnification to cover liabilities. And with that, I think I've covered the two topics, so happy to open this up for discussion as well.
Okay, well, thank you, BCG team, for sharing these insightful presentations and go into the details. So we will move now to the panel discussion and Q&A session to explore a little bit further some of these critical aspects of cross-border CCS, and also to address some of the issues that have not been to complement what we've heard in the presentation so far. So with that, I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists here. Again, Casey Delotel from ExxonMobil. Also, we have a very experienced and well-known panelist from the CCS world. There's Alex Zapantis, Strategic Advisor in the CEO Office of Global CCS Institute. Please welcome Alex. And also joining us in this session, of course, the BCG expert team. Before I start with the panel discussion, I would like to encourage our audience to continue submitting your questions to the Q&A function, and we will address as many as possible during this session. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen so we can see all the speakers on screen, and I can see the screen myself too. So actually, Alex, let me start with you. Could you please share with the audience what the work that GCCSI has been doing to support countries in their journey to accelerate CCS and also cross-border CCS?
Yeah, happy to, Han. Can you hear me okay? Just want to check my microphone is working. Yep, excellent. Okay. So we created something called SECA, the Southeast Asia CCS Accelerator Workshop Series, last year and the year before. We ran 3 workshops, first one in Thailand, second one in Indonesia and Malaysia. And the concept behind these workshops was to bring governments and project developers, and in fact, anyone that has an interest, together to discuss how to accelerate CCS. But we're also supporting a lot of capacity building activities in the region. For example, including those organised by ANGEA. We supported a capacity building workshop that ANGEA organised last year, I think it was. Just last week, we were at a workshop organised by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in Singapore. We partnered with the Indonesian Energy Academy to deliver capacity building workshops, and we're working right now with the Indonesia CCS Centre to deliver a 2-day intensive training course for Indonesian government officials. Next month, I'll be speaking at APEC capacity building workshop in Bangkok. So we are leaning pretty heavily into providing capacity building initiatives, but also doing advocacy to make sure that key stakeholders in the region understand the opportunity and the importance of CCS in meeting their emission reduction commitments.
Thank you, Alex. So with such regional perspective, actually, I would like to ask Casey a follow-up question. What role do you think the governments can play in ensuring and enabling and harmonizing framework for cross-border CCS?
So I think the key thing is to engage with industry and consult with industry on specific issues. Most of the governments in Asia are doing this. I don't want to imply otherwise, but it's really, these are new. Very few projects, the cross-border projects have been up and running. There's only the one in Norway at this point. The situation in Europe is very different from Asia. So having an engagement with the industry to understand the costs, how difficult to implement certain types of regulations are, that kind of thing needs to happen as countries agree to these bilateral arrangements. I think the 2 key things from the industry point of view is, first is the cost. Taking into consideration cost is going to be key to attracting investment dollars. These are very expensive projects and the tune of billions of dollars. If you add a huge amount of costs in terms of compliance, you could actually prevent some of these projects from going forward. The other thing is the ease of compliance. We want to meet the objectives. We want to make sure there's no double counting. We want to make sure that there's a sense of integrity around the process, but you can go overboard and be too prescriptive with the compliance. That not only adds time, but it also adds costs to projects. And again, it could prevent some of the investment. So I think these regular consultations with industry are going to be very important in getting sort of striking the right balance between implementation costs and meeting the objectives of the agreements.
Thank you, Casey. So you did mention that there's very little experience to learn from, and actually our study did look into what we can have in terms of experience to draw from and reviewing the existing case studies. So with that, I would like to move to BCG team, if possible. Could you share a little bit from your research, the learnings and experience from other examples that can, that Asia Pacific region can learn from, or something that we need to take consideration of?
Sure, Han. And maybe Carl, you want to start off on it? Oh, good. I think Carl is having audio issues. It's just WhatsApping me. Let's come back to that in a minute.
Okay. Sure. So with that, I probably would like to go through the questions in the Q&A submitted by the participants. The first question around Singapore has already signed MOUs with some countries to explore CCS. How is Singapore thinking about bilateral agreement in terms of who owns the rights to emissions reduction? I would like to pass this question to Casey to respond.
So we're encouraged by the fact that Singapore government has engaged with many of the storage countries in the region. They're in the middle of negotiations, so this is a sensitive time. So I won't comment on their position, but I do think it's indicative that Singapore is serious about putting in a bilateral arrangement and moving forward with a potential CCS project.
Thank you, Casey. Carl, you have come back. So Carl, in case you missed the question, I asked the question around examples from other regions. Of course, as Casey mentioned, it's not always applicable to Asia Pacific, but maybe for the benefits of the audience, can you share a little bit of examples that you've seen in the development of the study that inform the study?
Of course, yeah. I think if you consider Northern Lights as the key cross-border development, where we were able to sort of draw some references was on the way that the value chain has been structured, the value chain has been set up. But some of the key areas and challenges that Minai and the team have already gone through, which we don't have the consistency on in Asia Pacific, is that within the EU framework, especially between Norway and the rest of Europe, you have the ETS. So there is already a common carbon pricing system. There is already a common carbon trading mechanism, meaning that some of the challenges are essentially resolved for. Then you have obviously a common directive, not including Norway, but across the EU for the management of CO2 storage. So some of those commonalities that we are not going to be able to achieve in APAC are good as kind of references. But essentially what that meant that we needed to do as a team was kind of try to go under the sort of hood of some of those challenges to try and unpick and also unpack, what other areas, you could look to try and keep consistent between emitting countries, storing countries within Asia Pacific. Of course, we also have in Europe the London Protocol, the fact that most of the parties are signatories to that. Again, we don't have that same commonality in Asia Pacific. So I think where you look at the reference cases or where things have been done right, it gives us the framework, but it means that we have to go under the framework to really get things in the right appropriate manner. A few other areas where we were looking at projects were on sort of the way that maybe escrow accounts could be managed, or maybe contributions to long-term stewardship of some of the challenges, and we looked at the North American market, the European market, and others as well to kind of give ourselves some ideas on that.
Thanks, Carl. There's actually a follow-up question. It's more recent, but because it's related to this topic, maybe I picked that as well, about learnings from the cross-border pipeline transport between USA and Canada and the Dakota gasification project. Is there any insight on that, Carl, before we move on to other topics?
I don't think there's necessarily a direct insight on that because of the way that the fact that this is looking at permanent storage of CO2 and also the interlinkage between that CO2 and national net zero programs and NDC commitments. So I think there are elements of the commercial interaction on that are applicable, but I think the broad commercial construct of what that project is currently doing doesn't necessarily lend itself in the same light as to what we were looking at as the core of this project.
Okay, great. Thank you. There are a few questions around accounting. So if it is okay, I will combine these questions together for our expert at BCG team. So the questions around, the first question is, who's responsible for certifying the amount of captured and stored CO2? And if it is okay, if you can provide answers to the title transfer point of the CO2 and the accounting for leakages. Rachit and I.
So maybe I can offer some comments here, Han, if that's okay. So when it comes to certifying CO2, which is captured and stored, I think the starting point is that will mostly be the purview of the regulator in each country. So in the capture country, there'll be a regulator that deals with carbon accounting, carbon reporting, etc. And they will need to have methodologies in place and probably an independent verification process with audit as well to confirm that the CO2 has not been emitted, it has in fact been captured instead. Similarly, in the storage country, the most common approach would be for the regulator of storage and the regulator of carbon accounting in that country to have processes in place to confirm that CO2 which has been stored has actually been stored. So the way that I see it playing out really is the regulators in each country have the primary roles there in applying the relevant, developing if necessary, and applying the relevant methodologies, and then requiring the operators to report against those methodologies, and then also having an independent verification process as you would with any compliance requirement. And of course, all of this needs to comply with the sort of global norms and standards around carbon accounting.
Yeah, I can tackle the second question. I think the question came from Bernadette, right? Does the title transfer point of CO2 have a role to play in determining the options of emissions accounting? I think earlier on what I talked about was in a leakage situation, how do you determine what the handover point is where you transfer that liability of emissions accounting from the emitting country to the storage country? I think we have to be very clear that that handover point is different from a title transfer point. The title transfer point is typically at the project level where each of the operators, it can be from the shipping operator to the storage operator, all of these could be different entities, and that once they pass over the CO2 vessel to one another, that would be a title transfer point. So that's very much at the project level. That does not determine how emissions accounting work at like a G2G level. There could be implications of that title transfer point on emissions accounting for both governments, where they might say that because we need to hand over at this certain point, that point needs to be clearer in terms of which operator is responsible for the leakage, so that they can assign responsibility to the of the leakage to that specific operator. So there could be implications in that way, but the title transfer point is really different from the handover point from government to government. That needs to be decided within a G2G agreement versus the title transfer point, which is within that commercial agreement. where each operator decides or determines at which point do they hand over that responsibility. So if they are holding the title of the CO2, they could be responsible for compensation in terms of damages, but that would really be dependent on the conditions or the terms in their commercial agreement.
Minai, would you like to discuss the next question on accounting for leakages also?
During international waters, sure, happy to tackle this question, but Carl, Rachit, if you want to jump in also, feel free to. So I think during international waters, as I mentioned, it comes with the three options that we presented earlier on, right? Option one was the handover at the border. So this means that when the CO2 is within the waters or the borders of the capture country, any leakages would be counted towards the greenhouse gas inventories of the capture country, and then within the storage country is the same for them. So then in that option, during international waters or third-party countries, what happens would be that within that bilateral agreement, the capture and the storage country need to agree on how they account for the split. That's really up to the negotiations in the bilateral agreement, how they account for that. It could be 50-50, it could be 70-30. It really depends on how they negotiate on that point. So that's the first. If it comes to the second option, where it's that the transfer point is at the receiving terminal, so any leakages before the receiving terminal, including during international waters, is the responsibility of the capture country. This means that if there's a leakage during international waters, any leaked emissions would essentially be deducted from the claims that the capture country is able to make from the cross-border CCS project, because that would mean that the emissions that they were hoping to sequester had never been sequestered at the injection point, and therefore those are not real emission reductions. So that's for the second option. And then for the third option as well, it would be the same as the second option, given that the handover point is at the injection site. So during international waters, any leakages would be deducted from the emission reduction claims by the capture country. Of course, I think also want to caveat that while those are the options that we presented, we recognize that there's no one way to do it, or there's no clear way that has already been done and that works perfectly in today's world, right? Given that cross-border CCS is really nascent. So of course, these options could also develop, and there could be more options that we have not yet considered.
Thank you, Menai. Thank you. Then I would like to move to the next question, which is around the cost. The question is the proxy cost of CCS applicable to Asian countries. Casey, would you like to take up this option? And if you can, maybe you can share a little bit of some of the financing models and partnerships that you see for CCS and cross-border CCS in this region.
Sure. So I think the first thing to understand is each project is very different. So when we talk about proxy costs, you're really talking about a range, probably anywhere from $100 to $300 per ton. But it really depends on the specific project, how large the storage site is, how close to the capture site the storage project is, what type of capture you're looking at. There are big differences between the cost of capturing from like a coal power plant and a hydrogen production plant because of the concentration of CO2. So there's a lot of factors that go in, and there's really no one number. You're basically left with a range when you look at these things. Generally, when we look at a project at the beginning, we do a study to try and narrow down those costs, but that's really the only way you can get to a more narrow definition. In terms of finance models, particularly here in Asia, there's roughly two ways to go. The first is really working directly with the government to help them meet their goals. Many governments in the Asia Pac region have specific CCS goals. Working with them so that they understand how to meet those goals, what the costs are, what needs to be developed is important. The second, and these are not mutually exclusive, but the second is really responding to an incentive. the big examples of this are actually in Europe and the US, where like in the US, you have a tax incentive. In Europe, you have an ETS system. UK, you have a contract for difference where you can actually meet the full cost of the project with an incentive. In Asia, that doesn't exist yet. What you're really looking at generally is some sort of combination between a policy incentive, like a tax, and working with the government on meeting their goals. So in some ways it's more complicated in Asia, but I think it also reflects the fact that this cross-border aspect is new, and people need to build out infrastructure and things like that to get this started. Alex, do you have anything to add to that?
On cost specifically?
Yeah, on costs or the models.
Well, you're absolutely right. The costs cover an enormous range. I mean, if you have a very simple onshore project, like from gas processing, relatively close to your storage location, you already have a lot of good knowledge. Those costs can be really low, like $30 a ton, as per the Moomba project in Australia that just started operating. Of course, as soon as you start capturing from sources which have lower concentrations of CO2, and you start having to ship CO2, the price goes up very, very quickly to the sorts of numbers that you were quoting, Casey. So in Asia, for example, as soon as there's shipping involved, there's probably $100 a ton just in shipping costs or thereabouts. But it's going to depend very much on distances, scale, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many variables. So the range is enormous, as you've identified. In terms of finance, the big challenge with CCS everywhere, not just in Asia, is how do you make it commercial? Generally speaking, carbon prices aren't high enough anywhere really to justify the investment on their own. In Europe, of course, there might be an exception to that for some of the lowest cost projects. But there's always a need for governments to provide some sort of support to enable the private sector to invest the literally billions of dollars that is required, which is necessary to achieve net zero targets. If I can just say one more thing, it's very, very clear that the cost of achieving net zero is significantly reduced with CCS, especially in Southeast Asia and the Asian regions, and even considering the cost of transport and storage. So it's in everyone's interests that we find a way to make this work. It'll reduce the overall cost of meeting net zero targets very significantly.
Thanks, Alex. So I'm conscious of time. There is one more question that I thought I would ask Alex to answer, and then we will move to closing. So that is you talk about the cost and some of the risk. So how could politicians advocate and promote CCS to their constituents? And in this case, I mean, in terms of governments as well, what kind of economic benefits that you see and opportunities, Alex?
Yeah, so I guess the benefits that CCS offers is it reduces your cost of abatement. That's very, very clear. But as soon as you start talking about cross-border transport, it also has a couple of other additional benefits beyond the direct emission reduction benefits, cost benefits. That is, you're creating a new industry, new jobs around CO2 transport and storage. You'll necessarily establish hubs where you're aggregating CO2 for transport, for example, and infrastructure which is then available in that country to help manage CO2 emissions from its own industry. So it's not just the value of the services you're selling if you're a storage country, it's also underwriting the investment in that infrastructure, which will then help your own country meet its own emission reduction targets going forwards. And then once you have these hubs established, they will become attractive to industries wishing to establish in regions which require a CO2 management solution. So that can attract additional investment in new industries, new low emissions industries to produce, say, hydrogen or downstream energy carriers based on hydrogen, such as ammonia, to utilize that CO2 storage infrastructure. Once again, helping reduce emissions, but also creating new industries, new jobs, new investment, etc. So it really does tick every box: environmental, economic, and social.
Thank you, Alex. Well, with such positive notes, and it is time, I notice, I would like to close the session. But before I do that, I would like to thank the speakers and the panelists today for their valuable insights. So special thanks to Paul Everingham, who had provided our opening remarks, and Casey Delatal, Alex Avantis from GCCSI, and the BCG team, Rachit, Min-Ai, and Carl for joining us today. For the questions that have not been answered, we will try to follow up. And please feel free to drop us an email, follow up with us if you have further questions. Thank you once again, and have a good rest of the day for everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.